As I told you, I have been reading some things about you because it was like in very short notice that I knew that I had to do this.
Okay.
But I was very interested in knowing your background because you entered landscape through fine arts and romance and literature at Harvard, and then you did this undergrad and Ph.D. thesis in French gardens. That's what I'm interested in asking you is how it's to live and work in the American landscape now. It's so different from the European context, like in terms of scale, history, ecosystems, everything.
And politics, right? Which
Above
is
all.
yeah. That's a fascinating question because, and it relates to my background studying history of art. Because what I didn't know when I started to study history of gardens, really in a context of art history, was how powerful the paradigms formed in that period still are. So in the period that I studied, it's the advent of the picturesque format. It really becomes consolidated for various reasons. And it's still a factor with which designers contend today. Diana Balmori's most recent book, before she died, was about drawing. And it's about trying to break from the conventions of picturesque design. They're very powerful. It's like Hollywood cinema, in a way. It's a formula that works. But it's a formula that does makes certain operations that create additional problems. So, for example, it hides labor. It hides the fact that it's made. You see that in 18th century images where you'll have a painting of an estate garden, a private landscape, but you don't see the people who work on it, who make it. And that's still somehow part of this fantasy that landscape has that form because nature wants it to be that way.
Naturally.
It's very powerful. So, so I became interested in landscape through history, and now as I write and think about contemporary work, and as I make my own work, I do find myself in dialogue with that past a lot. So, but you know the American landscape too, and it must seem very different as you're driving around, or very artificial somehow.
That's like I wanted to guide the conversation towards that, because the American landscape, both North American and South American, the area around us, it's a very productive landscape. So it's what we see as natural. It's also very artificially made. And it's also a very pragmatic landscape in opposition to this picturesque landscape that you were talking about. So my question was, what's the role or how can a landscape architect work in this context of this pragmatic, very this landscape that works as a productive machine?
And when you're thinking pragmatic, you're thinking about agriculture, but everything else too. That's
mostly agriculture here in the Pampas and in the Midwest.
The problem is, in a sense, I feel like it's the same problem, because just as people see the picturesque as if natural, I think they also see agriculture as if natural. So the state next to the one in which I live in Illinois, the next state is Iowa, and many people think of Iowa as the most rural state. Most of it is agriculture. It's the state with the smallest percentage of land that is left untouched. So it's actually the most industrial state. so accommodating, one thing I think the landscape architects have to do as part of their work is to think about aesthetics, because the people have actually been taught to see architecture, agriculture as if natural.
Yes.
So they can also be taught other ways of seeing, other ways of knowing landscape. And in the middle of the country where I live now, there has been for a long time an interest in native vegetation, for example. But people 15, 20 years ago were so unfamiliar with it as an aesthetic that they would reject it.
Yes.
On our campus, when they created an area with native plants, the alumni wrote letters, they called, they said it looks terrible, why are you doing nothing there?
You're
and they said,
abandoning this.
yeah, right. So it's interesting because Jens Jensen practiced in Illinois. He was pioneering the use of native plants. And so there's been a lot of work over a long time, but it's taken a while. Michael van Valkenburg's entry landscape at the General Mills headquarters is another example. He planted this important entrance to a major industrial headquarters with native grasses, and there were birch trees around it, and some modern sculpture, so you could see this is intentional, this is designed. But a new executive looked at it and said, this is terrible, and they got rid of it immediately, like that, after 10 years. So landscape architects can help in very immediate ways, I think through very intimate scale work. They can help to transform people's aesthetic sensibility so that they learn to really like landscape in a different way. I mean, our job is to negotiate relationships between people and some idea of nature, some sense of nature or natural systems. So, and something I'll talk about today is, I actually think the smaller scale work, the very tangible physical work, is more important than the digital image making and the sort of addressing large scales. There's something about the tangibility and the immediacy of it that is important for practitioners, for designers, and for people in general.
Yes.
Yeah.
So also what you were talking about the aesthetics that the landscape architect can work on. You mean like showing how artificial this rural landscape is?
I think that it's all artificial, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in that
Yes.
sense, everything we're doing is that way. But we do have a better sense of how humans have created problems and how we might participate in a more responsible way. And so I would like the idea of people knowing that something is made by humans. I think that that's important.
Yes.
But I like along the way for them to know that how it performs. And so seeing how something works and being able to learn from experience about how it might be done differently, I think that that's extremely important. So it's not about creating illusions
Yes.
of that nature made it. It's about seeing, in the sense of the Anthropocene, it's about seeing our relationship with nature as something we're overlapping and we're enacting together. So, like the question of shared agency, that's completely different. That way of thinking about our relationship with nature now is completely different from how it's been thought of for at least 500 years, but probably much longer. So there are opportunities in there. It's not about it making it look natural in a different way. It's about seeing that relationship through the work,
Okay.
I think.
Very interesting.
And I think that can happen at the large scale. Landscape architects are interested in these huge scales.
Yes. Territorial scale.
Right.
Yes.
I think that it can happen there, but the territorial scale is an accumulation of
Small.
yeah, right. It's like, in truth, everything digital is analog. I mean, ultimately, it's an analog condition.
Yes,
but
or wants to be at a certain point, right?
Yeah. I think it has to be at a certain point. Like there's some mechanism, some analog mechanism that is going one way or the other based on some analog input. So it's a machine that separates or that abstracts, but ultimately it comes down to that.
Very interesting. Since we are here in the academic context of the School of Architecture, I wanted to ask you some questions about text I read from you. So in the preface of the 7th volume of the 306090, is it?
Yeah, 306090, yeah.
That you curated landscape within architecture, you talk about the difference between what was happening in the landscape in the 90s, when landscape was mostly thought as an auxiliary to architecture, and the changes that occurred in the beginning of the 2000s. But this book was published in 2004, so it's been 15 years almost since that moment. And I wanted to know what has happened since then. Yeah,
that's such an interesting question. At that moment, when I decided to make that book, I was very interested in how architects were talking about landscape. And that was because I had studied history of landscape, but then I was in an architecture school. And so I was an older student in the spectrum of things. And I was sitting at a table with Beatriz Colomina, and Mario Gandolsonis was there, others were there. And Mario Gandolsonis said, landscape is everything now. Landscape is for architecture now what philosophy had been before, what film theory had been before. And Beatriz said, I agree with you completely. And it was fascinating to me to say, what do they mean when they say landscape? Because one of the biggest problems about landscape is that people use it to mean so many different things.
Yes.
Like with my students, I insist that they develop working definitions. You have to be able to say, when I say landscape, I mean this, and you mean that, so you can communicate. So I wanted to understand how architects were why they were being interested in landscape and what they meant. So at that time, what I discovered was almost every architecture program in America had begun to incorporate some landscape coursework or programming into their curriculum. Inviting somebody to teach, doing special lectures, doing landscape-themed studios. 15 years later, I think it's gone. I find in architecture, like so many encounters with architecture, there's been a kind of reversion to building as object, building as object within landscape. It's almost like after all of that interest, it dropped backwards. So Diana Balmori and Joel Sanders were teaching studios at Yale, which brought architecture students and forestry students together. They don't have a landscape architecture program at Yale. And the work was fascinating. I mean, they did this 5 times, I think it was, over the course of 10 years, these studios. It was absolutely amazing to have these two types of students really working together. But I think that's more and more unusual now. And so there's a way in which architects have continued to think of landscape architecture as a sub-discipline or like a younger sibling, something on the side. I've never thought of it that way ever. I mean, and I made this point in this recent conversation at Harvard that I think of architecture as a sub-discipline of landscape architecture. It has to do with extent, complexity, the way systems work. So unfortunately for architecture, I don't think there's been much progress in that way. But for landscape architecture, the progress has been amazing. It feels so obviously more consequential to me now than architecture. the scales that they're thinking at, the way that they're thinking about systems, integration with systems, complexity, but also history. That landscape architecture is always a historical project, because you're always transforming or manipulating something that exists. That's also true of architecture, but there's this fantasy of creation, of poetry, that says, architects say they create space. In fact, architects take some portion of the natural realm, the realm of material nature, and they isolate it. And then they say, I made it. So it would be like, let's say this is a baby. I put the baby here, I put my arms around it, and I say, look, I made a baby. But I didn't make a baby, right? So I think that in truth, the origins of architecture are so different from that, but they've been narrated as object making, and landscape's been treated as an objective context. Landscape architects know that that isn't how it works. So, yeah.
And do you think it has more of a future within urban design or planning?
The landscape architecture does. I think it.
This approach that it's more interdisciplinary and open to change also.
I think both, and so I don't think of landscape as an adjective. So landscape architecture is not it's not a modifier in architecture. Landscape to me is a relationship, and it's a relationship that's negotiated through a wide range of media. Painting, architecture is one of those medium. So like landscape urbanism is not urbanism with a qualifier landscape. It's something very different. It's urbanism that negotiates a relationship. So I think the answer is both, and I think the most successful works of architecture will be those that are, I think they are, but will be more evidently so, those that are organized through landscape as thinking. I mean, understanding that work. What that allows them to be is more dynamic, which is more real, because buildings are moving all the time. Buildings are, form, as I've written, form follows temperature is an example, not form follows function. That's a reality. And engineers have worked with architects to reinforce a static idea of architecture, which is very false. It's not modern in the sense that it's not honest or true. But they could be working to make buildings that move as the sun arrives or as rain comes. Why not? So I think that landscape thinking will make architecture both more interesting and more honest.
Yes.
And I think that it's a more interesting way to think about any building that already exists. Because if you think of it as separating some portion of landscape from itself, I mean, the realm of material nature, it's doing this kind of work, then how you see the building operating, like why would it sequester, why would it hold this space? And in doing that, how is it trying to differentiate between inside and outside? What relationship is it negotiating? I just find that to be infinitely more interesting than the building as a sculptural object. That could be moved, right? There's the modern idea, it can always be moved, but
and this is kind of in connection to that has landscape architecture lived to the expectations of those involved in this change during the first years of the 2000s?
I think it's doing very well by those terms, and in thinking about people in the first years of the 2000s, the people who were in landscape architecture. So Charles Waldheim would be a good example. James Corner, another key figure in that. They were advocating for territorial thinking, urban scale work, and landscape architects have been really getting very close to that kind of scale or work. With that said, one of my concerns is that the scale of immediate experience is always present, but it hasn't been addressed. It's not addressed in that work. And so that to me is a problem, in part because students are being trained to think at really vast scales, and there's a sense that those are beyond the scale of immediate experience, so you need digital tools to understand them, to see them. And yet, a large waterfront urban park that's part of a complex infrastructure that's thinking regionally still has this level of experience. So what I would love to see is a reintegration of that scale into the larger. Right. One way to think of it is like the ancient idea of symmetry wasn't this. It was the idea of proportional relationships. So what happens if you're thinking at this scale and then you try to address something smaller? Does it work symmetrically in that way? Or at what point does it actually radically transform? I'm a believer in dimension as opposed to scale. I'm more interested in the size of something than the scale. I think scale is a term that gets used too much because some things don't scale up or scale down. At a certain dimension, the conditions change.
Yes.
A good example is if I dropped this, it would bounce. If this were an ant, it was tiny, the ant would be fine. But if this were an elephant, I might break its leg. So it's all going, half of a meter down onto the table. But there's something so very different about that, and it involves dimension. Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to talk with you about landscape architecture in academia. So you're here today for the presentation of the master program in landscape. That it's also the first master program that this school will have. So it's a very big deal for the school. I was reading your text from 2016, non-essential knowledge for new architecture. And you talk about the core knowledge in architecture programs, and you say, in professional culture, the body of knowledge encompasses everything the practitioner needs to know. And having studied at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, being an associate professor at the University of Illinois, and having all this experience in so many so many schools around the world, I think you may say that you know about academic programs.
I have some sense of it.
Yes. So what should then be the core knowledge of a master in landscape in architecture, and what do future practitioners need to know?
Well, first I congratulate you. Thank you for reading these texts, because I know you didn't have much time. So these are
they were very interesting.
Well, thank you. These are terrific questions. So one of my very strong beliefs is that there's so many ways to practice landscape architecture. There's so many ways to practice architecture. Professional programs in general were created to serve the profession. And so one of the driving questions in terms of what do people need to know is, what do they need to know to work in this way in this kind of professional context? And so that's useful, but what many programs do is they train students to the best of their ability to get to that point. What it means is there's an emphasis on communication, representation, technique. But when they get to the level where they're going to work in a firm, they're first working for someone else, so that might be useful, but they, in order to be most useful to the discipline, they really need to be able to think in imaginative, inventive ways. So the idea of training students to a standard is the smallest thing you could do. It's the most obvious, it's the most useful. So to stay with that for one moment though, I have large questions about even what that is. So for example, most landscape architecture programs emphasize representation, digital representation, because when they go to an office, they're expected to make these kinds of images. They're expected to make those images because the profession of landscape architecture, in order to be white collar, in order to be a profession, said, we make drawings. We make drawings that we give to other people to do the dirty work, the handwork.
Like to separate themselves from gardeners?
Yes, right, and the trades, right. So from landscapers, you say, in the United States. And that's not a good reason. That's not a good reason to continue to teach representation. And so one of the problems is you have students who are making drawings on computers of natural conditions of which they have very little experience. So they're presenting, they're not really representing. So when I teach our foundation studio, the first thing the students do is they make things at 1-to-1 scale with no representation. In most of my studios, I don't allow representation. You make the work. So you make it small. You don't make a massive project. So to me, one of the core values should also be to help any student figure out what that student really wants to do. It's very much like psychology, right? There's so many ways to practice landscape architecture that you really can pursue the path you want. It may not be in a conventional professional firm. You may do it through experimental theater or museum design or video game design or something very tangible, interactive. And so I think it's our responsibility to teach that as a core, and that you need to take advantage of the resources around you. So a university with many disciplines, like this one, where you have politics and philosophy and engineering and horticulture, to be embedded in a university like that is extremely important. Because students can take courses in other fields, they can think broadly as appropriate, and they can figure out their own way to work, to negotiate relationships. So in that text, I'm criticizing the idea of teaching to the central line, the idea that in order to become in any discipline, in order to become an architect or a landscape architect or a doctor or what have you, you go from new to accomplished, like a novice to a master, and this is what you need to know. But there's no change within that. It says this is the way it is. And then that model says the other line of significance is this edge. It's like the edge of a territory, right? So it may expand and it may contract, but the idea is that's where invention occurs. I think invention should occur in the middle because, and I say this as the son of a scientist who was an inventor, a physicist, what motivates change, like discovery, doesn't necessarily happen at the far reaches. Sometimes it happens right next to you. It's about an unexpected adjacency. So lateral typically means enrichment. It's like, here's the core, and maybe you do some lateral exploration because it's broadening some point. But to me, that's actually the most likely place for innovation, for discovery, and for transformation. So at the program where I teach, our students are very actively engaged with the university as a whole. And that's true for us as faculty members too. We participate in everything that interests us. So having a program here, among the things that I love about that is being in this university with so many disciplines, but also being in a university that already has an interest and experience in making things, in tangible explorations. So I think it's a perfect place for a new master's program. It's the right conditions to make a program that can be infinitely more interesting and successful than many of the ones that already exist.
So when you say about the core, you also talk about the front line in that text. And you say that what you were mentioning, innovative theorists and practitioners have long looked up to the edge when challenging disciplinary norms and imagining new possibilities for their work. The conventional strategy is to lay claim to the front line again, the most progressive position.
Mm-hmm.
While looking at other fields, that it's what you were mentioning, one foot in and one foot out.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know, where do you see the front line in landscape nowadays? So
that relates directly to the first question about urbanism and architecture. There's a modern tradition of seeing a discipline as a body, as something that has integrity, which is the same way that buildings have been seen and cities have been seen. It's like, this is a city. So, which is absurd, right? I mean, because what is the extent of an urban condition? You realize now it's so networked, it's so distributed, it's so constellated, we could say, with interesting points. It's so far-reaching. So, I don't think that the front line I think that the front line is continually reconstructed and reinforced through discourse about design, about innovation. It's part of the language, but I think it should just go away because it's the same sense of a city as an object or as a building as an object. It isn't that. So let's just make it disappear. But part of why I think of that's especially important in the case of where we are now in thinking about nature and our relationship with that is this is also how we saw the world. This is how we saw our planet. Mm-hmm. And there was, in order to see it this way, you have to be outside it, right? So there's a sense that in order to know the meaning of something, including your own life, you have to be outside it. They say that at the moment of your death, you suddenly see the meaning of your life. Yes. And it's because you can get a sense of it as if from the outside, and where nothing more is going to change. But we can't get outside our conditions. We can't get outside them. We can't ever actually see a city that way. It's a fantasy. So we have to learn how to navigate from inside conditions. And so going to that point about innovation being potentially right next to you, how do you know where you are? How do you know the meaning of something if you can't get outside it? And then the answer is it's through a way of mapping, in a sense. You triangulate. You say, I see that there, and I see that there, and so I know where I am relative to those. So if I go like this, I see that my relationship to those things has changed, and you can start to get a sense of trajectory. So you might then become interested in something else along the way. So the front line, in that sense, the place of innovation is the line that you chart as you actually move. Mm-hmm. It's a trace of the direction in which you're going at the rate at which you're going, even if you don't know what the destination is. The fact of going is the line of interest to me.
Well, in connection to that, the last two questions that I think. So thinking about this text that you wrote, or this preface that you wrote for 30, 60, 90, it's been 15 years now. How do you see landscape architecture in 15 years from now? And how should we prepare the students for the master? for that future?
I think it's very important to be very open because so much is changing, and that's a cliche of modernism. Oh, it's going to be so different 15 years from now. I mean, back in the 50s, the 1950s, they thought we would be flying in personnel helicopters by the 1970s, but those were fantasies about technology and its rate of progress. Those were fantasies that were constructed according to an idea of civilization, an idea of technology, and an idea of nature, of making progress from grassland to old oak forest. We don't think of nature that way anymore. We think of it in terms of the ability to adapt to disruption. So I think knowing the substance with which one works will be increasingly important. And I think of understanding one's position within those substances, so it's really ecological thinking, I think will be just essential. I think it will be normal. And one way to index that is like, what is the difference between before and after, say, 1980, when people began to think about nature differently? Thinking about it in resilience, if you look at a text like Ian McHarg's Design with Nature, that was written before we started to rethink what nature is. So when he's talking about design with nature and is interested in ecology, the way that we think about ecology now is so radically different. So I think we really need to abandon some of the paradigms, the attachments that we have to ideas that were consolidated before 1980, and to really start in a very new way, from a new foundation, which is again why it's so important to have a new program. It's such an opportunity because you can do that. You can just say, we're going to start here and move forward. So I have no idea what landscape architecture will look like in 15 years, but I'm pretty convinced that what people will see as exemplary work will not resemble the conventions that we know now. And today in my presentation, I'll try to show some examples from my own work where many people might have said 10 years ago, that is not landscape architecture, that's something else. But what I've found through my own work is the very idea that what I'm doing is landscape architecture is more and more accepted. So I'm seeing that transition like through my own experience. But I have no idea what's going to come next. It's part of the joy of teaching is I can only put forward ideas, content that I think might be interesting to people. But even as I do that, I have no idea what they're going to do with it.
Yes.
It's true of any class, but so being open to that uncertainty is I find it fascinating.
Yeah, and it always falls on someone new, on a new generation. That's what I love about teaching.
Yes,
so
yes.
It's like you bring all these new people that are going to take whatever you're saying in a different way. So.
Right. John Stilgoe, who at Harvard said many years ago that when you teach if you teach in math, if a student in their first year came in and said something about math that was new, that they hadn't thought about before, you'd be astonished. But in the arts and the humanities, it's entirely possible that someone who's never thought about your subject before will have a new idea or a position that you in 30 years of work have never considered.
Even more possible in the first years than in the last.
Right, there's a lot of this said there about education,
because they are not contaminated in a way.
Right,
by all these.
Right. Yeah, and that's part of what concerns me. I want students to not feel like that education is limiting. It should feel like it's opening.
Yes.
It's empowering, right? So what tools do you need to do the kind of work you want to do? Not how do you work for someone else, but how do you work for the future of a discipline that's changing, and how do you position yourself to find a line of significance for you.
Okay, I think that's perfect to close the interview.
All right. Thank you
so
very much.
much.
Thank you. Thank you.